Black elder ignored at funeral. The truth about him shocked everyone. A quiet cemetery, its serenity broken only by the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the faint hum of distant traffic. The mourners gather in small clusters, their faces marked with grief, their voices low and reverent. Conversations flow easily among them, soft laughter mingling with tears as they share memories of the deceased. But one man stands apart. An elderly black man, his suit slightly frayed at the edges, clutches a weathered hat in his hands. His posture is stiff, his eyes fixed on the casket. He stands a little way from the others, not by choice, but by unspoken design. He doesn't belong here, or so the whispers seem to say. Some glance at him briefly, their expressions betraying a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Others avoid looking his way altogether, as though his presence alone disturbs the solemn balance of the moment. One woman leans toward her companion, her voice barely audible but clear enough for the man to hear. "What's he doing here?" The elder hears it, but he doesn't flinch. Instead, he straightens his back slightly, gripping his hat tighter. He takes a hesitant step forward, but the weight of the crowd's unspoken judgment holds him back. He stays rooted in place, gazing toward the casket with an expression that's hard to read. There's sadness there, yes, but also something deeper, something resolute, something that says he has a reason for being here, even if no one else understands it. No one offers him a kind word, no one invites him to stand closer. He might as well be invisible. And yet, he doesn't leave. He can't. There's something tying him to this moment, to this funeral, to the man being laid to rest. This isn't just another funeral, it's the start of a story no one expected, a story woven with the threads of prejudice and resilience. A story about a truth long buried, and a revelation that will leave everyone shaken, and forever changed. The service begins, and the elderly black man lingers at the back, his eyes scanning the faces of the mourners. They exchange comforting words, share somber smiles, and lean on each other in grief, but not with him. He adjusts his worn suit jacket, the fabric, stretched tight with age, and clutches his hat a little tighter. He tries to step closer to the gathering, but the subtle shift in their body language stops him. A sidelong glance here, a slight turn of the shoulder there. It's enough to make his presence feel like a disruption. The preacher's voice rises, delivering heartfelt words about the deceased, describing a long life full of accomplishments and the love of a community. The black elder's expression softens at the mention of the deceased's name. A faint smile flickering across his lips, but no one notices. A mourner from the front row looks back briefly, her brow furrowing. She leans toward another woman, whispering something inaudible. Both glance his way, their eyes narrowing slightly, before turning back to the preacher. He shifts his weight from one foot to the other, trying to blend into the background, but he doesn't leave. He can't. Something keeps him rooted there, staring at the casket like it holds not just the body of the deceased, but the answers to why he's here in the first place. Earlier that day, the drive to the cemetery had been uneventful at first. The road stretched ahead of him, his mind lost in memories. But the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted him back to the present. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled over to the shoulder of the road. The officer approached his car with a swagger that carried an air of authority and disdain. "License and registration," the man barked, without a greeting. The elder handed over his papers with a quiet, "Yes, sir." His voice steady, despite the growing unease in his chest. The officer studied the documents for a moment, then peered into the car, his eyes scanning it, as though expecting to find something incriminating. "What's a guy like you doing out here?" he asked, his tone heavy with suspicion. "I'm on my way to a funeral," The elder replied simply, his hands resting on the steering wheel where the officer could see them. The officer smirked. "A funeral, huh? Fancy place for someone like you? You sure you're at the right one?" The elder didn't respond. He just looked straight ahead, his expression calm but firm. The officer lingered for another moment, his eyes sharp and searching. Finally, with a dismissive wave, he handed back the papers. "Don't cause any trouble," he muttered before walking back to his cruiser. Now, standing at the edge of the mourners, those words echoed in his mind. He thought about leaving, about walking away from the quiet rejection he felt pressing down on him like a weight. But then his gaze returned to the casket. No, he couldn't leave. Not yet. As the service continues, the elder's mind drifts back to the encounter earlier that day, the one that still lingered like a sour taste. He could feel the officer's gaze even now, the way he had looked through him, not as a person, but as a problem waiting to happen. The officer's parting words echoed in his mind. "Don't cause any trouble." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Trouble. The only trouble he ever caused was living long enough to see moments like this, to feel the weight of the world's dismissal again and again. He hadn't always been so invisible. There was a time when his presence commanded respect, when his actions had meaning. Life-saving meaning. Those memories were distant now, buried under layers of quiet endurance. But as he stood there, staring at the casket, they rose unbidden, clearer than ever. He thought back to that moment years ago, in a foreign land surrounded by chaos. The heat, the smoke, the sound of gunfire all around him. He could still feel the weight of the man on his shoulders, his limp body dripping blood as he ran through the open field, exposed, vulnerable. Bullets whizzed past, hitting dirt, tearing through the air inches away from his head. He remembered the sharp sting of pain as one grazed his arm. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not if he wanted them both to make it out alive. The preacher's voice broke through his thoughts, drawing him back to the present. "We gather here today to honor a man who lived a long, full life," the preacher said. "A man who touched the lives of many in this community. A man who was there for his friends, his family, and his country." The elder's heart ached at those words. He knew the deceased better than anyone else here, better than the mourning family, better than the preacher himself. Yet here he was, standing alone, unacknowledged. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the feeling, but the weight of it was too heavy. It wasn't just about today, it was about every moment like this. Every quiet dismissal, every glance that said, "You don't belong here." Then came a shift in the preacher's tone, one that made the elder lift his head. But his story, like all great stories, is incomplete without acknowledging the sacrifices of those who stood by him. There are moments in life when we are shaped not just by what we do, but by the actions of others. The elder's breath caught. A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd as the preacher continued. "Many of you may not know this, but during his time in the service, our dear departed brother found himself in a moment of great peril. His life hung in the balance, and it was through the bravery and selflessness of another man that he returned home to his family." A murmur of confusion spread through the mourners. The elder's hands trembled as he gripped his hat. Could it be? Did the deceased truly remember? For years, he had convinced himself that his actions were forgotten, that his sacrifice was buried, along with everything else from those harrowing days. The preacher gestured toward the crowd. "And that man is here with us today." The murmurs grew louder, heads turning, eyes searching. The elder felt every gaze suddenly fall on him. The weight of their scrutiny was overwhelming, but he stood frozen, his mind reeling. The preacher's voice rang out. the man who carried him to safety, risking his own life to ensure he would live to see his family again, is standing among us now. All the whispers, the dismissive glances, the judgment. It all stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The elder stood still, his heart pounding, unsure of what to say or do. For the first time since he arrived, all eyes were truly on him. Not in disdain, but in awe. The preacher nodded toward him, a gentle smile on his face. "Mr. Williams, we thank you for your courage and your sacrifice. Because of you, he lived to become the man we celebrate today." The elder's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. He looked around at the faces now gazing at him with respect, admiration, even shame. The shift in their expressions was almost too much to bear. He could feel the weight of years of invisibility lifting, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time. Acknowledgement. The silence lingered for a moment, heavy and charged, as the reality of the preacher's words sank into the crowd. One of the deceased man's family members, a middle-aged woman, hesitated before stepping forward. Her eyes were wide, with a mix of gratitude and remorse, as she approached the elder. "Mr. Williams," she began, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. None of us knew. I'm so sorry." Her words were halting, but sincere, and they broke the dam, holding back the emotions of those gathered. Another mourner, an older man, spoke up. "You're the reason he came home to us. You're the reason he lived to build this family, this community." His voice cracked. "We owe you everything." The elder finally found his voice, though it was low and unsteady. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, his gaze drifting toward the casket. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. He was my brother out there, and I'd do it again if I had to." The tension in the air softened, replaced by something warmer, something healing. People began approaching him, one by one, offering their apologies, their gratitude, their tears. The woman who had initially dismissed him embraced him tightly, whispering through her sobs, "Thank you. Thank you for giving us him." For the first time that day, the elder felt like he belonged. The weight that had pressed down on him since he arrived, the judgment, the isolation, it was gone. In its place was a sense of connection, a sense of being seen. As the service concluded, the family invited him to join them at the front, standing by the casket of the man whose life he had saved so many years ago. They asked him to share a few words, to help them remember the deceased, not just as a father, husband, or friend, but as a soldier who lived because of a profound act of bravery. The elder stepped forward, his hands still trembling slightly, but his voice clear. "We served together in a time when division was everywhere," he began. "But out there, in the chaos, none of that mattered. We weren't black or white, we were just men, fighting to survive, fighting for each other. And on that day, I wasn't thinking about the color of his skin. I was thinking about the promise I made to him and to every man out there, that I'd do everything I could to bring us home." His voice broke, and he paused to gather himself. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. We live in a world that still struggles to see past the things that divide us. But I'm here to tell you that in the moments that matter most, those differences don't mean a thing. What matters is how we choose to show up for each other, how we choose to see each other, how we choose to treat each other. The elder stepped back, his words hanging in the air like a benediction. The crowd stood, many with tears in their eyes, moved not just by the story, but by the truth he had spoken. As the gathering dispersed, several mourners lingered to thank him again, to shake his hand, to ask for his forgiveness. For the first time, he felt not like a stranger, but like a part of something greater. As the elder stood by his car, watching the family slowly disperse. He felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of acknowledgement, not just for what he had done, but for who he was. The image of the little girl hugging him lingered in his mind. Her innocence, her unfiltered appreciation, was a stark contrast to the dismissive glances he had endured earlier that day. He turned back one last time to look at the casket. His mind wandered to the war, to the day he made the decision that saved the man now being laid to rest. It hadn't been easy. He could still feel the pain in his legs, the burning exhaustion as he carried the wounded soldier through enemy fire. But he never regretted it. He hadn't done it for medals or recognition. He had done it because it was right. And yet, all these years later, he wondered how much had truly changed. How often had his sacrifices been forgotten, erased by a world too focused on differences to see the common humanity that binds us all. Today had been a painful reminder of that. But it had also been something else. It had been a moment of reckoning, of revelation, and, ultimately, of hope. As he climbed into his car, he noticed several mourners waving to him from the cemetery gates. They were different now, not just in their actions, but in their expressions. There was humility in their eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the man they had overlooked. It wasn't enough to undo the years of invisibility he had endured, but it was a start. Driving away, his thoughts were heavy yet hopeful. The road ahead seemed longer, but also brighter, as though something important had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had been at that funeral. He hoped they would carry the lesson with them, share it with others, and work to create a world where no one had to prove their worth, to be treated with dignity. The elder spoke softly to himself, as if addressing the deceased. "Rest easy, brother. Maybe this time they'll remember what matters." This story isn't just about one man, it's about all of us, our biases, our assumptions, and the walls we build between each other. Racism isn't just loud acts of hatred, it's the quiet moments when someone is ignored, dismissed, or deemed less than human. It's in the sideways glances, the whispered words, and the silence that lets it grow. But today, we saw something different. We saw what happens when the truth comes to light, when we're forced to confront our own prejudices and recognize the humanity we've overlooked. The man they ignored wasn't just a hero in the war, he was a hero in life. And heroes like him walk among us every day, unseen, uncelebrated. It's time we start seeing them. This is a call to action, to look beyond appearances, beyond stereotypes, and beyond the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs and who doesn't. To acknowledge the contributions, sacrifices, and humanity of every person, no matter their race, their background, or their circumstances. The world doesn't change on its own. It changes when we choose to see each other, when we choose to listen, to learn, and to act. Today, they finally saw the man who had been invisible for so long. Let's make sure we don't need another funeral to open our eyes. See each other, respect each other, be better, because the world is watching, and the change starts with us. The elder drove on, the sun setting behind him, casting golden light over the road ahead, and for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not for what he had done, but for who he was. And that, more than anything, gave him hope for the future.